Hi, folks. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. My name is Andrew Gustafson, and we're going to get started in just a minute. We have a very special guest today. We're really excited to welcome back Howard Goldstein, who is the forest ecologist for the Prospect Park Alliance. He's going to be joining us in just a minute. I see we have some repeat visitors, so welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much for your support and coming out this afternoon, coming out, so to speak. So just a couple quick housekeeping things about how the program is going to work. First off, you may be seeing closed captions down at the bottom of the screen. You can turn those on or off. They're actually automatically generated. So you can do that either at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, or if you are using a mobile device, a phone, or a tablet, you may have to exit out of the session, turn on or off the captions in the app settings, and then come back into the session. We're also going to be communicating today primarily through the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, and I'll be sure to pass them along to Howard as we go along. We'll also drop in links and other information that's pertinent to today's topic. If you're joining us for the first time, just a little bit about who we are and what we do. So our organization, Turnstile Tours, we work in partnership with nonprofit and community organizations around New York City to help them build capacity to welcome the public. And so we run the tour programs at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Brooklyn Army Terminal. We work with New York City's public markets. And since 2017, we have been the tour provider for the Prospect Park Alliance. Unfortunately, our season didn't really kick off this year because of coronavirus, but we've been very lucky to have so much support from the team at the Alliance to be able to do virtual programs. So we've done I don't know, 15 or 16 virtual programs just about the park since March. So you can go to our website at Turnstile Tours and check out some of those past programs. We also have some upcoming programs. So I'm just going to pull up my screen here so you can see our upcoming calendar. So coming up, our next program is going to be on August 23rd. We are going to be looking at some interesting prints that are about 100 years old that were printed by this company called Epinal. And we're going to have an expert on 19th century French art who's going to talk to us as well. But it's really about paper doll making. So we're going to do a little interactive kind of thing. Certainly not something that we touch on in our in-person tours normally, but this is one of the opportunities that we have with virtual programs is kind of expand our repertoire a little bit. And this is something that I've personally become very interested in over the last several months. On August 27th, we're returning to Prospect Park because we are going to look at the Revolutionary War sites of the park to celebrate Battle Day. On the 31st, we're making our way over to Staten Island to visit the National Lighthouse Museum. And then on September 2nd, we're continuing our series which is highlighting the history of New York City in World War II to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. So on the 2nd, we're going to look at two battleships, very important in World War II, that were built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. On the 6th, we're going to look at the wartime history of the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And then on September 19th, we're going to do a free program with our friend Teresa Leung, who made a documentary film about her father, who was a POW of the Japanese during the war. So it's called Every Day is a Holiday. So you can visit our website, turnstyletours.com, to check all that out. And all of this is made possible, of course, through your support. So we do about one free program per week, but then we do 2 or 3 paid programs each week as well. So we greatly appreciate if you join us for a paid program. You can also become a member, and membership entitles you to not only access all of those paid programs, but also to access our library now of 125 recorded programs, as well as members-only content, and we'll hope to be doing in-person events for the general public as well as special for our members. So that's what we have coming up. But without further ado, I want to welcome Howard to the program. So let me just invite him to turn his screen on. There we go. How's it going, Howard?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm good. Great to see you again. I know it's been a few months since we had you on. Last time was on Earth Day, but we are really excited to learn more about the trees of Prospect Park.
Fantastic.
Um, yeah, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your role at the park as the forest ecologist?
Sure. So as the forest ecologist, I do a lot of the scientific monitoring in the park. I do some scientific experiments, and I'm responsible for working on restoration sites and restoration work within the park, choosing the plant palettes for the types of planting that's going to be done, and working with the ecozone gardeners in project that they're doing. And I also try to work with my managers to create an integrated ecological landscape within the park, which we do, which I do with the landscape managers and then with all the ecozone gardeners who are working in the park.
Great. And so just so people understand, you're not an arborist or a tree doctor,
Now,
but trees are a very important part of your work.
absolutely. So trees are a huge part of the work because so much of the natural habitat in Prospect Park is woodland or forest. So I'm dealing a lot with forest restoration, forest protection, forest research, forest monitoring. But I'm not an arborist. So things relating to directly treating trees for disease or cutting trees and limbing trees or dealing with things like the memorial trees that get planted, that's actually not my jurisdiction.
Hmm. And if you have any questions, we are going to look at some specific tree species today. And maybe you have a favorite tree or a notable tree that you want to find out about. Feel free to drop that into the chat as well. But I'm going to pull up your slides here. So just bear with me for 1 second. And just let me know when you can see this, Howard, okay?
Yep.
Great. All right. So take it away. And like I said before to folks, if you have any questions, we'll drop them in throughout the presentation. So feel free to ask it at any point. We won't just save them all to the end. All right. Okay, Howard, take it away.
Okay. Okay, well, obviously one of the first things I always like to talk about, why are trees so important to cities? And trees and forested areas within urban centers are proving to be extremely important. They provide a lot of pollution control. They do a ton of carbon sequestering, taking up and holding carbon from the atmosphere. They're very important for stormwater and flood control. Any kind of non-paved surface that allows water to actually seep into the ground is incredibly important in preventing sewers from backing up and flooding during storm events. Temperature moderation is very important. That has a very profound effect on cities, and it provides critical wildlife habitat for urban wildlife and for migratory wildlife that flies over cities. But another very key thing that forests and wooded areas in urban areas do is they provide human beings with certain emotional and aesthetic needs that really can only be met by being within nature. We're not separate from nature, and human beings need nature and draw inspiration from nature. And there's really very few things that are as majestic as trees. And trees have inspired people for thousands of years. Next.
So we're just pulling up a map here, Howard, so that we can orient people a little bit. I know many people on the program have probably been to the park before, but just so we're give us the lay of the land a little bit about some of the kind of key forest areas and some of the areas we're going to be talking about later on today.
Absolutely. So one of the key, probably the most key forest area, if you see kind of the dark green or darker green area, yeah, in the middle of the park there, that is our core woodlands. That is the largest and most intact big block section of forest that we have in the park. And every place that you see that is that darker green color is forested or partially forested. A lot of that central area falls under a category called Forever Wild, which is legally protected as protected forest land in perpetuity. Other things that are not in that designation, though, are still, if they're valuable woodlands in the park, of course, they're gonna stay that way, and we're gonna continue to improve them and conserve them. One of the, a very key area outside of this core area, if you look at the map, if you look at the west side of the park, along Park Slope, and to the very, very end there, to the Bartell area. Yep. This is actually a very, very interesting area of the park. 3 or 4 years ago, this area was lawn, was part of the lawn, but it wasn't even really the lawn. It was an area that people would come into the park from that entrance, and it was completely trampled by people. If you looked at it back then, what you would have seen is a handful of large trees, things like London plane trees, a couple of oaks, some maples, some ginkgos, things that have big mature trees that have been there for the past 80, 100 years. And then you would have seen bare ground, not even really grass. It was trampled. It was bare, brown, compacted dirt and nothing else. A few years ago, we at the Alliance got a mandate to restore this area to a forested region. It was fenced, and we began the process of restoration by planting trees, planting shrubs, planting herbaceous ground cover, seeding, removing of invasives as they started to pop up. And a few years later, this area is unrecognizable from what it was originally. It is becoming a forest. And it's fascinating to see a forest from scratch and to be able to watch that grow and to be able to monitor it and study it and really from the ground up have this woodland that can be really studied in perpetuity. It is green, it is dense, it is filled with, we've counted over 80 native species of plants, not just trees, but plants in this area now. It is native dominated. It has, in addition to those large old trees I was talking about, it now is beginning to have an understory of things that eventually will be canopy trees. And it's a spectacular area. It's also one of the key areas in the park for oak regeneration, which I will talk about a little bit later in the slide. But that's actually a very important thing. So this is really a very, very important key little forest area that we've restored and created within Prospect Park.
And back to a point that you made before about the Forever Wild designation, what are some of the areas of the park that fit that?
That central area, that big darker, yeah, that whole area, and then further, yep, that whole area.
All the way up here, including the Sullivan Hill area and everything? Okay.
Yep, all of that, the Midwood, the area kind of behind the ball fields where you just were. And then if you...
Oh, down here?
Yep, all that area, the darker green area.
Okay.
And there's a couple of other areas, but that's kind of the main block of the Forever Wild core area.
Is Lookout Hill?
No, Lookout Hill technically is not.
Okay. So that's
the bottom of the peninsula is.
Right here.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Wow. Well, great. So again, if you have any questions about different areas of the park, this is just to give you a little bit of an orientation. We just had a question here, which is, what are mattress trees? I'm not familiar with that term. Is that a term you're familiar with, Howard?
Mattress trees?
Yeah.
I apologize. I'm actually not familiar with it.
Oh, okay. So maybe if a person who asked the question, if you could clarify a little bit, or maybe give us some context, and hopefully by the end of the program we can get you some sort of answer. But I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll go to the next slide here.
So what kind of trees are in the park in a general sense? The vast majority of the park's trees and the world's trees are angiosperms, are flowering plants. All the other trees in Prospect Park, the few that are not flowering angiospermic plants, are gymnosperm plants. They don't produce true flowers. The seeds are naked. And those are in Prospect Park. Those will be the conifers. We have white pine. We have some eastern red cedar. We've got a couple of eastern white cedar, a little bit of hemlock, a some non-native things that are ornamental trees, and then we have the ginkgo, which is a very ancient tree and the only surviving member of its group. Most of the park's trees are winter deciduous. They do lose their leaves in the winter. The exception being the conifers don't. And there are a few non-conifers like American holly that keeps its leaves. Most of them drop their leaves. There's approximately, give or take, there's about 70 species of trees in the park. Now that includes both native and non-native. And most of the oldest and largest trees in Prospect Park are in that core woodland area that we were talking about earlier. Next. The original forest cover in Prospect Park, most of Brooklyn was an American chestnut and oak forest. The American chestnut declined in the 19th century tremendously. You can see the map there. That's the original range of the American chestnut. And within that range, 1 in every 4 trees in the forest was an American chestnut. The chestnut blight of the 19th century really wiped out most of our chestnuts. It didn't really affect Brooklyn as much because fortunately, in quotes, they'd already clear-cut all the forests in Brooklyn. By the 1800s, there was already 2 centuries worth of clearing by European settlers. So there was really no ancient forest left even by the mid-1800s. Most of the area that was formerly chestnut and oak mixed forest, where hickory was also important, then became an oak hickory dominated forest. And that's kind of the forest that we are using as the template forest for what should be in Prospect Park. Oak hickory forest is very high value to wildlife. These are very high wildlife value trees that produce nuts that feed a lot of things and support a very high number of invertebrates, which then support a lot of birds, etc. Next. If you look at the map there,
Howard, I just had a quick question for
Sure.
you. So Bob asked a question that there are some chestnuts that have been replanted in the park, and sort of what is the status of those? Is Bob's question.
There are a few chestnuts that are living in the park. Unfortunately, chestnut blight tends to get most of them once they've reached a certain size. I can find out for you what the largest and oldest remaining chestnut is. We do have some people from the American Chestnut Society or affiliated with them who are very helpful to us, who are interested in planting chestnuts. We have one person in particular, Bart, who works with us sometimes to plant some chestnuts and see how they do. We would love to have more chestnuts in the park, as part of the native flora, but we just have to be realistic about it because the chestnut blight is in the park and it's bad. We have had some good news again. There is some chestnut living in the park, and chestnut conservation organizations like the American Chestnut Society are working on a number of different ways to try to bring the chestnut back. One of them is hybridizing with the Chinese chestnut and then back crossing to get something that is mostly American chestnut, but hopefully has the Chinese chestnuts genes for resistance to the fungus. The fungus came from Asia. It evolved with those chestnuts. They're more resistant to it than the chestnuts in Europe and North America. So hopefully there'll be, continue to be good news on that front. Prospect Park is often called Brooklyn's last forest. And again, it's not continuous ancient forest, but it is by far the largest, oldest block of woodland really left in the interior of Brooklyn. If you look on the map, it really is all concrete in the interior of the borough, except for Greenwood Cemetery and Prospect Park. And Prospect Park is more heavily forested. All of Brooklyn was forested, of course, prior to European settlement. Although as you move east, you start getting into prairie as well, which is interesting, but that's another story. As I said, by the mid-1800s, there had already been over 200 years of farming and forest cutting in Brooklyn. So by mid-19th century, there really probably wasn't any true old growth virgin forest left in Brooklyn. But Prospect Park does have the oldest and largest trees that are still left in Brooklyn. And this forested area is really critical for preserving Brooklyn's native plants, preserving wildlife, and preserving our natural and cultural history here in Brooklyn. Next. I'm going to get into some of the most important and most obvious native trees in Prospect Park in a second. Just some things that can sometimes be helpful is leaf characteristics. This isn't a tree ID course, but I'm going to mention some things. So I want to show you one of the things that really is a good way to determine is by looking at the leaves. So if you look at the picture on the screen here, you can see a simple leaf and a compound leaf. On the compound leaf, that entire structure actually is a leaf, and what looks like little leaves are considered leaflets. So that is considered a compound leaf versus a simple leaf. Then you have, if you look to the left, you have pinnately compound leaves, where you have them on either side of a central vein. You have palmate compound leaves, where it's arranged more like the palm of a hand. And also important in tree identification is opposite versus alternate. If you look at the picture where it says alternate leaves, and they give an American beech, you can see that the leaves are coming alternately patterned on that twig. If you look below it and look at the maple leaf, that's an example of opposite leaves. The leaves are coming off directly opposite each other. Next. So one of the most important trees in Prospect Park are our oak trees for a number of reasons. One is they are, again, one of the dominant native trees that define the forests in this area. They are incredibly important wildlife trees. They are very important for people as well. Historically, culturally, oaks have always occupied an important place in human history, not just for wood, but even just live oaks standing out and being, and just being trees. It's a favorite tree. There's a lot of historic trees. Oaks are projected to be able to handle climate change in this area well, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But so they are a very high priority tree for us. And most of the oaks in Prospect Park are northern red oak. That is the dominant oak species. The white oak and the chestnut oak, not to be confused with the true chestnut. If you look on the bottom, that's the chestnut oak. The leaves look like chestnut leaves, hence the name. If you look to the left, you see a red oak leaf and a white oak leaf. The red oak leaf more to the left. The red oak, the lobes are pointed, whereas on the white oak, the lobes are rounded. And the sinuses, those spaces between the lobes, vary in depth depending on the species of oak. The red oak group, which again is more pointy, there's a red oak group and then there's a white oak group, oaks that are more closely related, and that's also something I'm going to mention later as it pertains to a certain tree disease. Other oaks in the park, we also have pin oak, swamp white oak, scarlet, black, and bur oak. And again, those red and white groups, which I'll get into as needed. Please, yes, next one, please. Another very important tree genus in the park are the maples, the Acer species. Our native trees are native maples. We have mainly sugar maple, red maple, and box elder maple in the park. Maples are opposite leafed. They have samaras, that fruit that's hanging in the corner there. You see the helicopter things that people find. Those are actually the fruits of maple trees. And maples are another very common tree, very good for wildlife. And if you click next, and very beloved because of their incredible fall foliage. When we think of fall, we're really thinking of maples more than any other trees. And to the left and below are sugar maples in fall foliage, and the one on the top right is red maple in fall foliage. And they're really spectacular. And if you've been to Prospect Park in the fall, especially when we have really spectacular years, some of the sugar maples really need to be seen to be believed. Next. This is not a maple, but it's a very common tree. It's also a common tree in the park and an important one. This is called sweet gum. And if you look at the leaf, it's reminiscent of a maple leaf, and people can be fooled. But the leaves are alternate instead of opposite. So if you look at the twigs, you can see that it's not a maple because it's not opposite. And the leaves themselves are very pointy. They're very star-shaped. And after you've seen them a few times, you kind of get to know that, okay, that's a sweet gum. The little spiky balls are the sweet gum balls. That's the seeds are inside that. Those are the things you find on the ground all the time. And it's a sure bet that there's a sweet gum nearby if you find that. These are actually for birds. There are certain, some of the birds with short, thin beaks, really the finches and things like that. Some of the seed-eating birds really like to get the seeds in there.
So we had a couple questions related to some of the things that you said. So the first is, you've mentioned a little bit like with the sweet gum, but you said especially about oak and maple that they're really important for wildlife. Could you share a little bit about why those trees in particular are good for wildlife?
Absolutely. So these are the trees, these are some of the dominant trees that evolved in this area, and it evolved with the other plants, it evolved with all the animals in this area. So there's a lot of ecological relationships inherent in these systems. So the things like the oaks and the maples and all these other trees, they provide a lot of food for animals. The ones that, the Samara, the maples provide food for some animals. The oaks produce acorns, which is a very important food source for a wide variety of animals. In areas where there's large animals like black bear, turkey, deer, things we don't have in Brooklyn, of course, but in other areas, those are major food sources for large animals. It was a major food source for humans, for native people. And even today, larger birds, mice, squirrels eat the acorns. There'll be a slide later where I'll show this again, but I'll say it now too. The red oak tree throughout its range in eastern North America, it is host to over 500 species of insects. Insects are the building blocks of our ecology, really. They're, the world is kind of if you like, you can't hate bugs and like birds. Birds, almost all bird species in our area feed on insects at least as part of their diet, and a lot of their chicks are dependent on insects. So it's very, very important to the birds. But northern red oak supports over 500 different species of insects. A ginkgo, which is not native to North America, supports under 10. That gives you a sense of, yeah. So we'll talk about that a little later, but yeah,
Amazing.
So it's very important.
Speaking of food, I was just waiting for someone to ask this question, and someone did, so thank you. And the question is, do the maple trees, the sugar maples in the park ever get tapped? And why don't they get tapped for syrup?
They don't get tapped. They don't get tapped in the park. I mean, I can't guarantee nobody has ever come into the park with the tap and tried it.
Right.
But officially, we don't do that. And we don't do it because we really don't have. I don't think we really have the capacity to do that on any kind of a meaningful level. And I think the major reason really is this is not my forte. I don't know a lot about the maple tapping industry, but I think the main prerogative is to try to just keep things natural, to try to keep the trees healthy, to not mess with them. I'm not saying maple tapping necessarily is bad for the trees if done right, but it's not really something we're looking to do. And we also don't have vast stands of them. We have them, but we don't have like vast stands of red maple.
And I'll add, as a longtime resident of Vermont, it doesn't get cold enough.
Okay.
So that's a really important part of the cycle, is getting really cold, and then when it starts to get warmer in the spring, that's when the taps start to run. So you could try it in Prospect Park, but you probably wouldn't get very much out of it. But yeah, so it takes a little bit more than just having a sugar maple tree. You need the right environmental conditions too. Great. So keep your questions coming. So what are these plants that we're looking at here?
This is the tulip tree, not to be confused with the tulip flower. This is Liriodendron tulipifera. The flower that you see is reminiscent of a tulip, especially from the side, and it produces these really distinctive, beautiful flowers early in the season. And then if you look at the leaf, it's very distinctive. There really is no other tree in Prospect Park that has a leaf that really looks anything like this. So once you kind of just get used to the shape of that leaf, you will always be able to tell a tulip tree. Tulip trees grow very fast. They grow very tall. They're very good native trees as kind of a supporting cast for the oaks. The only problem with tulip trees is that they can also, they're somewhat prone to storm damage. So that's also something to consider where we plant them, but it's an excellent native tree.
And while we're on the subject, I'm sure many people, if you've been in the park over the last week or so, may have noticed what was the impact of the tropical storm last week in the park?
Well, we officially lost, I think I think it's 60 trees based on a certain certain technical definition of what we're going to actually count. Lost even more than that. Lost a lot of branches. It was a mess. But it's been cleaned up pretty well, and it's continuing to be cleaned up.
Great.
This is an eastern black cherry. The leaves are glossy and lightly toothed, as you can see. They have those white flowers. They produce cherries. The humans tend to not find black cherries particularly tasty. But you can eat them, but wildlife absolutely loves them. And if you look at the tree bark, one of the most distinctive things about black cherries is once they mature, they have this very distinctive bark that really looks like burnt potato chips on a tree. So it's one of the identifying features, especially of an older mature tree. When they're younger, they tend to have these you can see these horizontal little dashes in the trunk of the tree going that are called lenticels. Birches have them too, but that's also useful for black cherry. And this is a tremendous wildlife tree. First of all, the fruits are eaten by anything that eats fruit. The flowers are important for pollinators, and the black cherry itself supports, like the oak, it supports a huge amount of insects. And it's actually a host tree for a huge number of butterflies and moths native to the area. Not necessarily the sole host, but there are, I have to get the number, but it's an absurdly high number. It's literally dozens and dozens of butterflies and moths can lay their eggs on an eastern cherry and have the caterpillars survive. Next. White ash is another tree. I added this slide later because I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that ash is having in the park a little later on. White ash is, the leaves are compound and opposite. They have what looks like half a samara. The fruit, it looks like what the maple samara fruit looks like, except instead of the double end, it just looks like half of it. And the bark tends to be very deeply furrowed, again, on a mature specimen. I also included the twig there. The buds are fairly, those three-pointed light brown fat buds are also a good indication of white ash. We also have green ash in the park, which is related, just not as common as the white ash. Or white ash, but they're having trouble, which I'm going to talk about.
We just lost you for a second there, Howard. If you could just repeat the last thing you just said.
Just that some of the really beautiful, huge old trees in the park are white ash trees, and white ash trees are having problems now, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
And I'll just add, if we have any baseball fans out there, we've mentioned that the two species that are used for making baseball bats, which is white ash and maple. Okay.
So those were some of the native trees. There's a lot more, of course, but those are some of the big canopy trees, or the most abundant trees that we deal with on a constant basis in Prospect Park. Now we're going to talk about the invasive trees. These are the trees that are not native, that take over and cause a lot of problems. Many of them were intentionally planted in the 19th century, sometimes even earlier, sometimes a little bit into the 20th century. They were brought here as ornamental. for a long time until relatively recently, when they were trying to recreate European style parks in North America. There was just this bias that somehow the European trees were better because they were in the European parks. So we brought over a lot of those types of trees, not realizing the impact it's going to have ultimately. Some trees were brought in just as good city trees. They're just trees that tolerate city conditions very well. So if you're going to have street trees, they've proven themselves in Europe. They were brought over here to do the same thing in our cities. One of the problems with the invasive trees, with invasive anything, they outcompete the native trees, which again are have all these ecological relationships with other plants, with animals, with microorganisms, everything that goes into that. And they can form monocultures. They can really, you can just get whole stands of just this one type of tree that on top of everything else isn't even particularly productive to other life forms. Wildlife depends on native species. And I'll take a quick, if you take a look here, two of the biggest problems that we have in Prospect Park, both of which were planted intentionally early on as ornamental trees that did good and well in cities. We have the Norway maple and the sycamore maple. The sycamore maple has, if you look at the leaf, it's just very broad. It's like it looks like it's as wide as it is tall. It's got that. It doesn't have much differentiation between the lobes relatively. The bud is also green, which is also unique to the sycamore maple. The Norway maple looks like a sugar maple leaf, which can be a problem. So when we're removing Norway maples but don't want to get rid of sugar maples, fortunately there are things we can do to be sure. One thing is, if you flip the leaf over, the back of a Norway maple is very glossy and shiny almost, whereas the back of a sugar maple is duller and there's often little whitish, fuzzyish stuff on the back there. But if you go to the next slide, the surefire way to tell is pluck off a leaf. And Norway maples ooze of a milky white sap that's very obvious and very distinctive. Later in the year, during drought years, sometimes they don't produce a lot of it necessarily. You may have to pull more than one leaf to be sure. But Norway maples always have this white sap, and if you see the white sap, you know it's a Norway. Next. Paper mulberry is another bad invasive we have. We actually have, there are 3 mulberries present in Prospect Park. The red mulberry, which is an uncommon North American native mulberry, the only mulberry native to North America. We also have the white mulberry, which is foreign, which is invasive, and the paper mulberry, which is invasive, both from Asia, both brought over, combination of ornamental and to try to start up silkworm industries, as the mulberry leaves are the only known food of the silkworm moths that produce silk. They are very invasive. They are problematic for a number of reasons. They grow very fast. If you cut the tree down, new shoots come up from the stump. They spread underground as well and sucker. The new shoots and will start coming up from the root system. Very difficult trees to get rid of. And if you look at the fruits, the paper mulberry fruit there and the white mulberry fruit, which is very berry-like, are very favored by birds. So birds eat the fruits of these trees and fly around, and their droppings spread the seeds all over the place. So these are very difficult. These are very common and difficult invasive species to deal with. Next. Two other trees that are not as common as the 3 that I was talking about before, but are issues, are the tree of heaven and the Amur cork tree. The tree of heaven is on the left, the Amur cork on the right. Little pictures there. The tree of heaven, Ilanthus altissima. That's the famous from the tree. A tree grows in Brooklyn. We really wish it didn't. It's an invasive tree. It can really take over. It's a good city tree because it really survives. It survives in cities very well. It will survive some of the worst conditions in cities, but it will clone itself. It will create groves of monocultures of only itself. It outcompetes native trees. And it does something else that's very bad that I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's also a host for a new pest species, which I'm going to get into, which is a problem. Amur cork, same thing. It's very invasive where it gets in. Best way to tell a tree of heaven, if you take one of the leaves and crush it, it smells like rancid peanut butter. And if you take a twig and kind of cut it open or pull open the bark, the pith is spongy and brown. On the more cork tree, the pith is a bright yellow, which is very obvious. Next. Climate change. We're actually going to talk about this in an upcoming presentation, so I'm not going to talk too much about this now, but climate change is another issue that as park managers we're dealing with on a constant basis. As climate already is changing and is predicted to change more, some native species are predicted to shift their range. The classic example is the sugar maple. We were talking before about, Andrew was talking before about how sugar maple needs a certain period of intense cold. And it is not a tree that likes dry, warm weather. And as temperatures warm and winters get shorter and warmer, that's one species of tree that we are concerned about. The overall range is predicted to shift further north. And we don't know, depending on how severe it is, we're not quite sure what will happen in the park. We could essentially lose sugar maples in the park. We might be able to keep some of them in moister, cooler microclimates in the park. And we're going to talk more about that at a later time about how we're trying to manage for these types of things. Another thing with climate change is increasing extreme weather, superstorms and tropical storms and hurricanes and whatnot. We had Sandy a few years ago. Some trees withstand storms better than others. So in terms of damage to the forest and damage to buildings and to human safety, we also need to take that into consideration. Climate change can bring new pests and pathogens. New pests and pathogens can also come into the system and always have without climate change, but climate change can exacerbate it by making conditions more suitable for certain species that otherwise might not do well in what our climate used to be, in a relatively colder, more temperate climate. Natural life cycles of when trees go dormant, when they leaf out, when they bud, when they flower, etc., can get disrupted or changed, which causes problems in a number of ways. One being if it's no longer in sync with pollinator activity, that creates a huge problem for both the trees and the pollinator. And some species are predicted to expand their range north. So things like the Kentucky coffee tree are species that in the future may become even more, they're here now, but they may become even more prevalent as their native range just continues to shift north. And again, we'll talk about this more at a later time. Pests and pathogens, again, for the reasons I said, climate change can exacerbate this. It can allow pests and pathogens that otherwise couldn't deal with the climate otherwise. Although again, it's not necessarily the cause, and there are things that absolutely have been and could be here regardless. But some of the big problems we're having in the park now is emerald ash borer, ash yellows disease, oak wilt, and spotted lanternfly. If you look on the bottom here, the emerald ash borer is recently discovered within Prospect Park. It's been in the United States longer than that. It is devastating to ash trees. It can wipe out entire forests of ash trees. The larvae tunnel, you can see the EAB tunnels, they can tunnel through the tree, and they will kill ash trees. And unfortunately, we do have them in the park now. Next slide. On the left, we have a tree suffering from ash yellows disease. The emerald ash borer, sadly, was kind of the nail in the coffin for ash trees. Even prior to them being in the park, we've had massive ash die-offs from this disease called ash yellows, which is caused by a bacteria from a bizarre group of bacteria that don't have cell walls, which is unusual for bacteria, and they attack the phloem of plants. The phloem is the tissues that move food, nutrients, and there's no cure for it. There's not a lot is even really known about it. It's a very hard disease to prevent or cure, and it causes problems for our ash trees. Oak wilt, if you see the picture next to it with the hand pointing, oak wilt is a very bad disease. There's basically 3 terrible fungal diseases that have ravaged the trees of North America. Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight, and now oak wilt. The fungus causes what you're seeing there is that the spores of the fungus cause the tree bark to swell and rupture. It causes these discolored patches. And if you find that, you alert somebody immediately, because that's a very good indication of the oak wilt. It attracts, these open wounds in the trees attract beetles that feed on the sap, pick up the spores on their body, and then go to the next oak tree and transmit the fungus. Oak wilt can also be spread underground through root contact. It is a very bad disease of oak trees. I'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to do about it, but it's another challenge we're facing in the park. I guess I'll talk about it now. Basically, what we do with it is we monitor. We've been lucky. We have had a few cases of oak wilt very near Prospect Park, and I think we have had a few confirmed in Prospect Park. The trees have been removed immediately to prevent spread to other species, to other oak trees. And fortunately, we have not had bad outbreaks in Prospect Park, knock wood. What we're doing to try to prevent it, it's very, again, it's difficult. I don't think there's really a cure for it. Prevention is the best bet. So what we do is we monitor for it. We are on the lookout for any signs of an infected tree, which we can then hopefully isolate and remove if necessary. I mentioned the white and red oak groups before. The red oak group, those species of oak trees, for some reason, are much more susceptible to oak wilt disease than the white oaks are. The white oaks can get it, but they're less likely to, and they can survive longer. So one strategy is we try to also plant a lot of oaks from the white oak group, which, if there is an outbreak, they may be less vulnerable to it, so that we'll still have a lot of oak trees in the park. We try to, sometimes we'll try to plant oak trees a little more spaced out to try to prevent some of the root contact. And one of the most important things that we do for management is we do not prune oak trees during the warmer months when the beetles are active, because wounding a tree, that will attract the beetles. They'll smell the sap, they'll come to it, and that's how the disease gets spread. So a major thing that we are doing is limiting any kind of pruning or work on oak trees to colder months when the beetles are dormant. On the bottom is the spotted lanternfly. That's a relatively new pest. It's in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia. It is now in New York State, and it was just confirmed in Staten Island. We are very concerned about it getting into Brooklyn. Honestly, it probably will. So we're also monitoring for this species. This is another thing that I mentioned the tree of heaven before, the ailanthus. The ailanthus is the primary host of this pest insect. This insect comes from Asia. It's not native, and it really keys in on the ailanthus, but the problem is it's not limited to the ailanthus. It also will lay its eggs and feed on a lot of species of our native trees. So that's a very big threat to some of our natives. And we are trying to, we were always trying to remove ailanthus because it's invasive, but we're especially trying to identify and remove ailanthus or tree of heaven trees from the park now to try to keep the lanternfly out. Next. So what I was just talking about is part of of managing the park's forest, disease control, mitigation of pests and issues. We're constantly monitoring the forest's health, not just for pests and pathogens, but just in general for what kind of trees, how are the trees growing? What are the plant communities? Is it mostly native? Are they being choked out by non-native vines? Are the age categories of the native trees appropriate to sustaining a forest? These are a lot of things we look at. And we have been working with the Natural Areas Conservancy and with New York City Parks in trying to integrate Prospect Park into the larger New York City Forest Management Framework, which is where we're basically trying to think of New York City's forests as a cohesive whole and provide kind of an integrated management plan citywide to maintaining and restoring native forests. We do, one of the things that we're using now is a tool called Rapid Site Assessment. I'm not going to get into it too much just to avoid taking up too much time, but it's a relatively newer system that allows for relatively rapid assessment of the site, provides a lot of key information, and then that information is statistically analyzed, and we get results on overall forest health based on a number of metrics and criteria. And that helps us make management decisions about what we're going to do next, what areas we're going to try to restore. We have to be selective because it's a big park. It's a 576-acre park, I think. About half of that is considered wild area, not necessarily forever wild, but it's considered, natural. And around 200 acres, 150 to 200 acres is actively forested. So it's a lot for us to do. So we have to pick our battles a little bit and prioritize. We do a lot of planting. We try to, especially in areas where we remove non-native trees and non-native vines. When there are openings, we will try to jumpstart it by getting desirable native trees in, like oaks, like hickories, when we can find them. All the trees that I showed you as far as native trees are trees that we plant, actually, except the black cherry because it's so prolific on its own, and the ash, unfortunately, because they're probably doomed. So we try to, we hope for the best with ash, but we're not actively planting because it would probably be futile. With different trees for different habitat types, we try to definitely keep wildlife in mind, different wildlife considerations. Some birds really prefer, not many, but there are some birds that like denser forest, and some of the areas of the interior midwood that are really more closed canopy. Denser forest is very valuable for those species, including we actually had a pair of goshawks, two years in a row have nested and successfully fledged chicks in Prospect Park in one of the denser wooded areas, which is a very good sign. And again, providing food for wildlife in the form of seed, considering seeds, berries, fruits, and insects that come to the trees. We also try to protect forests from the ground up with being cognizant of the herbaceous understory, the forest floor. Bare forest floor is not good. It causes erosion. It's not useful to wildlife. It causes soil destabilization. There's a lot of symbiotic relationships, some of which we're only beginning to understand between different plants, between trees and different and herbaceous plants, between herbaceous plants and microorganisms in the soil. So these things are very important as well. And by restoring those ground levels, we're also helping to restore the forest. Next. Just a couple of examples of ground cover. On the top left corner, that's Pennsylvania sedge. It's a woodland sedge. It's a great ground cover. Next to that, we have sweet woodreed, which is a grass that likes kind of woodland edge. It's also a very good competitor to something called Japanese stilt grass, which is very invasive, which is not a big problem in Prospect Park, fortunately, but in other areas it is. The next one over is Virginia Beauty. That's a spring ephemeral, which is a very short-lived flower on the forest floor that really, it blooms before the trees really leaf out when it's still getting sunlight, and it goes dormant as the tree leaves come in. And we're finding that spring ephemerals also, more scientific studies are coming to light about how important that is to the forest in ways we weren't even thinking. On the bottom left is white wood aster, one of the most common flowers in the park that we see in the fall. Next to that is yellow trout lily. That's another spring ephemeral that in certain areas, you'll see a lot of them. They're beautiful in the end of March, April. And then the last one there is wild ginger, which is not a true ginger, but it's a ground cover, a native ground cover that is often associated with oaks and seems to have, there's probably relationships that it has with oaks that we're just starting to learn. And it's a very valuable ground cover as well that we're starting to use. Next. We'll kind of conclude a little bit before with sort of some unusual native trees of Prospect Park. We have just a couple of things that are just kind of interesting. We have American persimmon, Paw-Paw, magnolia, and Osage orange, which is actually not a New York native originally, but it's a North American native. It's very interesting for a couple of reasons. Long Island, if you look at Long Island on a map, it's very often it is the northernmost range or near the northernmost range of a lot of southern species. So things like magnolias, which are most species of magnolia are southern, we do get the Sweet Bay magnolia that does get as far north as about Long Island. So it's actually, Brooklyn can be an interesting floral zone. The American persimmon, we don't have a ton of it in the park, but we do have some on Lookout Hill. We've discovered some persimmon as well as some other places. The fruits, pardon me, are edible, and it's a very exotic looking fruit for a temperate tree. The fruits are very distinctive. The flowers, which I unfortunately didn't get a picture, are very distinctive. So you can kind of tell the persimmon.
Before we go on to the next tree, yeah. We had a couple questions. So Maggie asks, could you repeat what the Virginia Beauty is again? What kind of flower that is? That was
yes. So the Virginia, yeah, that was yes. Those are the little white, like purplish white flowers on the top right. Yeah. I'm sorry, that's Spring Beauty. That's called Spring Beauty. And that is, I said that is called a spring ephemeral. It flowers, it comes up on the forest floor in very early spring before the trees have really leafed out. And it goes dormant shortly after the leaves really start leafing out. But things like this are really important for some of the early pollinators, for example. Different pollinators emerge and are active at different times, and flowers like this can be very important to, spring flying pollinator insects.
Mm-hmm. And Bob asks, do you have any crepe myrtle in the park?
Not to my knowledge, no. And I'm smiling because my parents live in South Carolina, and crepe myrtle, of course, not from Asia, but it's a beautiful tree, and it's all over the South. It's been planted, and right. My parents have 3 crepe myrtles in their yard. So.
Yeah. So you said it's not native; it's from Asia.
It's not native; it's from Asia.
And then Corey asks, I know that there's been a tree census that's done. So his question is, how do you track and document the trees? And then at what point is a tree deemed large enough to be included in the census? So when does it go from maybe being a sapling to being a full-fledged tree in terms of your count?
Oh, well, there's a couple of tree surveys that have been done. The most recent one actually was a survey of Brooklyn street trees. That was conducted by the city. That was not conducted by the Prospect Park Alliance and was not done in the park at all. So that has nothing to do. I mean, it's good information for us to have in terms of, managing in the context of Brooklyn, but we don't have that information specifically. The other survey that was done in 2018, 2019 is there was a park-wide tree survey, but that was, as I said, yeah, as you mentioned, it was dependent on size. It was also dependent on, it had to be a certain distance from from a paved surface, and it yielded about 16,500 individual trees in that survey. There are a lot more. There's probably more around 30,000 trees in the park, was the estimate I was given. I was actually, even though I was here, I was the preliminary for this started before I became the forest ecologist, and I actually did not conduct those particular things. So I can find that out, what the diameter was, but I actually don't know off the top of my head. What I mostly do is, while I do use that information, some of the general information that has been recorded from those surveys, when we do restoration areas, I am able to do various types of monitoring, again, to determine what tree species are present and approximately what percentages, the health of the trees, whether the trees are being infested by vines, whether there's recruitment, or there's going to be seedlings, or there are mid-story trees. And then there's a lot of different statistical analyses that can give you numbers, and from there you can get a sense of the overall health of the forest and make decisions.
So I know we're just at the hour mark right here, but I just wanted to run through these last couple of trees that that you have these unusual trees, because I think they're ones that are certainly notable and people have probably noticed if you've been in the park.
So the Paw-Paw is another one. That's also, it's typically a southern tree, but in rich bottomlands in New Jersey, you can get this tree. Really odd tree. It has big tropical looking leaves. Its bud is very distinctive. It's got like what's called like a paintbrush bud. I don't have a great picture of it, but and of course the fruit. It's got this big tropical looking fruit that is edible. So that's a really interesting tree. Next one. The sweet bay magnolia that I mentioned earlier in Long Island is a native tree. It's northern edge of its range. It's typically a tree of the southeast, and it's a very interesting tree, I think, because it's a very ancient tree. I mentioned at the beginning the angiosperms, the flowering plants. The flowering plants evolved long after the conifers and the ginkgos. So in the middle of the Cretaceous period, during the age of dinosaurs, magnolias evolved, and we have fossil magnolias dating back to the end of the age of dinosaurs. So this is a very, very ancient tree. The flowers are not pollinated by bees or butterflies or flies, or certain pollen flies, as is the case with a lot of flowering plants, because they really preceded the diversification of these pollinating insects. I have to check what pollinates a magnolia. It might be beetles, it might be more primitive flies, or they may have a mechanism that it's not even a pollinator. But it's a very interesting tree because of how ancient it is and how it, the flowers are not geared towards the typical pollinators. Next. And finally, the Osage orange. This is a really interesting tree to me because this is an Ice Age relic tree. During the last Ice Age, during the Pleistocene epoch, this is a tree that lived south of, well, all the trees lived south of the glaciers, but it's a relic species. In the modern era, the Osage orange's native range is restricted basically to a little corner of northeast Texas, eastern Oklahoma, maybe a little bit into Arkansas. It's a very, very small native range for this tree. But the wood is phenomenal for making bows. So the Native Americans highly valued this tree. They planted it, they spread it, and then European settlers, also liking the quality of the wood, did the same. So this tree is now fairly widespread thanks to human beings actively spreading it from what began as a very small, restricted range left over from a previous time. The fruits are very distinctive. If you look at those huge grapefruit-like fruits, there's really nothing quite like them. The original method of seed dispersal for this species may have been being eaten by giant Ice Age mammals. That because usually you see trees, flat fruits like this, very hard on the outside, but edible, but seeds scattered throughout the flesh of the fruit. It's typical in more tropical locations, and they're very often spread by large mammals. I've heard a theory that giant ground sloths may have been what fed on this and spread it initially, then they became extinct. And there's on the Nethermead, as you get close to anyone who's familiar with it, there's a very obvious Osage orange tree. And in fact, this past summer, it produced so many oranges, we actually had to rope it off for safety because they were coming down like bowling balls. So we actually had to cordon the tree off for human safety, yeah.
And that relates to the last question here, which is, what are some of the native mammals that are found in the park? So we obviously don't have sloths anymore eating that. What are some of them that also might benefit from some of this habitat?
Well, in terms of I'm not sure in terms of the Osage orange.
Right, I mean in general. In terms of
yeah, the mammals we have, the mammals that we have in Prospect Park, we have the white-footed mouse, which is a native mouse, raccoons, Virginia opossum, gray squirrels, eastern chipmunks, It is possible we have flying squirrels. They're secretive and nocturnal, so it's there. You'd have to really look for them. So they're kind of a question mark. And we have at least 5 species of bats flying around in the park. And then we have Norway rats, house mice, and field rats.
And possums.
We do have opossums, yes, as a native animal.
They asked about also foxes or any coyote sightings in Prospect Park.
We do not have any foxes or coyotes in Prospect Park yet. We do have people from the Coyote Project have set up cameras in the park to see if a coyote ever came in. To date, there's no indication that we've had a coyote. Brooklyn might be a little difficult because it is so urban, but having said that, there are now urban coyotes. There are coyotes living in Chicago. They're incredibly adaptable. So while it's not a sure thing, it's not impossible either. So we are on the lookout for coyotes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a nice scene of Prospect Park.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you so much, Howard, for joining us today and sharing this incredible knowledge and insight. And thanks to everyone for sticking with us. We know we went a little bit past the hour mark, but it was such an interesting conversation and so much incredible information. Anything else you want to add, maybe about how people can help with preserving and maintaining the forest in Prospect Park?
Absolutely. By far the most important thing you can do to maintain the forests in Prospect Park is to follow the rules and follow the signs in places where we ask people not to walk or not to put things on the trees. Please do adhere to that. It really does protect our forests. And the other thing you can do, though, is really enjoy the park, really appreciate our forests, really visit them, tell people about them, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your elected officials how important the forests of Prospect Park really are to you. And really just come and enjoy the park. It's really their, human enjoyment of the park is a huge part of the mandate. So we're glad it can provide such a service for people. And
Bob adds to help to keep it clean.
Yes.
The park, you mentioned at the very top of the program how important the forests are for human emotional health. And I've definitely found it's helped me a lot through this pandemic, but we're also finding that a lot more people are also seeking, some kind of refuge in the park. And so it's really important that everybody, take responsibility for everything you bring in and take it out of the park, and please become a Prospect Park Alliance member. It's really, really important, especially with the challenges, not only more use of the park, not only all of these, environmental challenges that Howard was already talking about that they have to contend with, but then severe budget cuts by the city of New York. The Alliance become even more important to the health and maintenance of the park. So we encourage you all to become members of the Alliance.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great, Howard. Well, thank you so much. I'll just add, if you want to join us again in Prospect Park, our next program at the park is going to be on August 27th, which is Brooklyn Battle Day. And we'll actually be doing that program from the park. We hope to maybe show some of the trees today in the park, but it was pouring rain all morning. And of course, it stopped raining the minute we went on air. But come join us on August 27th for the next one about Prospect Park. And then on September 2nd, we'll be continuing our series of programs about the history of New York City in World War II. So again, Howard, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And you can also go back to the show page. So go back to our website and find the page related to this program, and we'll add a series of links related to a lot of the stuff that Howard talked to us about today. Okay? All right. Thanks so much, Howard. Have a great day.
You too.